It all seems like such a long time ago, but for those who lived through it, the Second World War is still a vivid memory. German U-boats were the scourge of the North Atlantic. They threatened our very survival. And they might have succeeded, but for the strategic importance of Londonderry. Lough Foyle provided the city with a natural defence, and Derry became the most important base for escorting ships in the entire British Isles. During the Battle of the Atlantic, which lasted for over 5 years, Derry was the vital link in the chain that was our lifeline with the United States. It's now over half a century since the war ended, and once again the ships are back. But on this occasion, they come in peacetime, a reminder of the enduring importance of this city during World War II.
The city was quite simply the most important escort base that the Allied navies had for the Battle of the Atlantic on this side of the Atlantic. And that can be summed up quite easily. There were 139 seagoing warships, escort vessels, based here in 1943, 1944. It was 1944 before they opened Belfast as an escort base. And at that time, the number of ships based in the River Foyle exceeded the combined numbers based at Liverpool and in the Clyde and in Belfast. And that's an indication of just how important the city was.
In the 1940s, Derry was a much smaller city than today, with a population of around 45,000. But add to that a British naval presence of between 12 and 20,000, a fixed American service population of 5,000, and several thousand more coming in and out of the city on the escort ships. Then there were Canadians, Free French, Free Norwegians and Russians. You also had ships of the Royal Indian Navy. Then there were the soldiers manning the anti-aircraft guns around the city, and Air Force personnel. All in all, the service population added a further 30,000 again. Derry played its part, but has always been shy about its role.
I think Derry is not fully aware of just how important it was during the Second World War. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that the Germans only bombed the city once. I have no doubt at all, knowing the German plans for an offensive against Britain in 1942, an air offensive against Britain in 1942, that had they not attacked Russia in June of 1941, the Luftwaffe would have been back in strength over British ports and British cities in the winter of 41-42, and one of their prime targets would have been the city of Londonderry. And there is absolutely no doubt that they would have pounded that city out of existence.
During the war, Derry and Lough Foyle played a pivotal role in the Battle of the Atlantic. The city relied heavily on neighbouring Donegal. It may have been in the neutral Free State, but that didn't stop it helping the war effort.
The truth of it was that Ireland was neutral on the side of the Allies, and that was the general briefing that was given to Allied personnel coming to the northwest during the war. Moville, for example, was involved quite deeply in the war because the ships would have come in off Moville, sailors would have come ashore in Moville, so the people of Moville would have been very, very much aware of what was going on. Aircraft from Ballykelly of Coastal Command and training aircraft of the Fleet Air Arm from Eglinton and from Maydown would actually have flown out over Donegal, and again this was a concession allowed by the Irish government. There were many, many thousands of people from Donegal and from other counties in what's now the Republic who were actually working in Northern Ireland as part of the war effort.
And on the Inishowen Peninsula, overlooking the mouth of Lough Foyle, Charlie McCann, Dan Gillespie and Jimmy McLaughlin talk about old times.
I remember one evening in bad weather, I counted 57 ships anchored in Moville Bay from Greencastle up to Moville Bay. And that is a fair amount of ships, big and small actually, tankers. There's a great refueling depot, and there used to be tankers in Moville Bay to refuel the destroyers all the time.
There was about 12 pilots here.
Pilots.
Now they were all from here, Sroof, or Carrickfergus.
From Donegal.
They're all so-called neutrals. They're all working for His Majesty's Navy. In fact, I remember they were awarded the Atlantic Star for their contribution to the Battle of Atlantic. And
even though they were technically neutral.
Yeah, I remember my father and others, they wore the ribbon on their uniform and walking about here. You know, they're supposed to be neutral.
Was there much talk at that time about the U-boats?
No, there's a bit of a myth which is circulated that they used to be refueled in the Free State. I think that's a load of nonsense. I mean,
Yeah.
I actually saw a letter in a paper not long ago, somebody looking for information about the refuel of U-boats in era. I mean, that's a complete fabrication put out by certain political people.
U-boats under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz hunted in wolf packs. They roamed the Atlantic at will. The cost in shipping and lives was immense. 30,000 men, women and children on the Allied side. German losses weren't much lighter at 25,000. Both paid a high price. The Atlantic Ocean was so vast and the shipping lanes so long that Derry became important because it was so far west. Hitler's mistake in turning his attentions to the east saved the city, which then went on to play such an important role in the battle to keep the U-boats at bay. Lieutenant Commander John Scott carried out escort duty for the Royal Navy. He earned 2 bars to his DSc. He was demobbed in 1946, met a local girl, and made his home in Derry. Today he's on a guided tour of one of the visiting ships. This frigate sailed from Holland. During the war, the Free Dutch also served here. John Scott is now 94, but clearly there's a common bond between these two men from different naval generations. Were the submarines the thing that sailors feared most at that time?
Do you know, the sailor feared nobody. The sailor just took what was coming and he said, well, with God's grace, we'll be here when it's all over. Let me take you through the operation. In we go. We fire a pattern of charges from the stern, and then we swing the ship around onto the contact, and we go ahead. Confirmed contact, oil rising to the surface. Right. We fire our missiles over the bow with press button accuracy. Submarine destroyed, sir. Lifted the ship, literally. Can you imagine? The explosion, lifting a ship out of the water. This unquestionably was a perfect attack.
On the 55th anniversary of the end of the Battle of the Atlantic, 3 warships from the Royal Navy, the Dutch and Polish navies paid a courtesy visit to Lissahalli. Veterans and officers from today's Navy gathered in a marquee on the quayside to remember those who had given their lives. Among those in Derry on the day, the German naval attaché from London. The poppy wreaths which were taken on board the ships would be dropped into the sea on their departure from Lough Foyle. You'd think a former member of the Royal Navy would claim that they were the heroes. Not so, according to John Scott.
You know, I must tell you this. In my opinion, if that counts for anything, the heroes of the war were those chaps who manned oil tankers, because when they were sunk, as so often they were, they hadn't got a chance for sale. They hadn't got a chance to be picked up because they were enveloped in flame and ships couldn't get near them. And the water, when the ship was sunk, the surface was on fire, and we couldn't get near them, any of them. We couldn't get near because of the heat of the flames on the water, and this meant death. Now then, who would volunteer to go on board an oil tanker in whatever capacity? These dead further here.
How did it make you feel, John?
It made me, I feel, looking back at the oil and the flames and the dying men leaping over the side, into the plane. Can you imagine the peril? What does it seem? They were the heroes.
During the war, the mayor of Londonderry was speaking to the commandant of the US Marines. You say your men can do anything. Well, they can't play the bagpipes. The rest, as they say, is history. The first US Marine Corps pipe band was formed in Derry in 1943. Today, the leatherneck, pipes and drums, descended from that original band, have returned to the city to commemorate the service of the US Marines during World War II. Among the local people who came to watch, one woman with a lot of memories.
My friends and I were out, as usual, walking around the town, and I went in to buy some chips and a wee fish shop down in William Street. And he was at the counter getting served, and he looked over and he smiled at me. And then he followed me outside and started talking to me, and he left me home. And then he asked me for a date, and I went. But my aunt didn't allow me to go with Americans. She forbade me.
Why was that?
I don't know, she had a thing about them. But I went with him anyway. I was only going about 9 months a year, you know, whenever he was shipped out, like, you know. But he never left the house in Bridge Street, and he was very kind to me brothers, you know.
And you missed the departure as well. Tell me about that.
Well, we were all supposed to go down to see the ship at Lissahalli, going away that day. I can't remember what date it was. I know it was sometime in August. And by the time we got down, we had no money for buses or trains. The ship was away out, and I missed it. And then I came home, and that was the end of the romance.
And so, a chance to catch up on old times. This scene could have been repeated often during the war. One woman, the centre of attention for admiring soldiers. Phyllis had many questions for the Americans and special reason to remember her one particular Marine. When did you then discover that you were pregnant?
Oh, I can't remember. I think it was my eldest sister. She noticed, and she told my mum, and my mum told my aunt, for she was she helped my mum, and my mum was a Buddha. And she took me to doctors, and they discovered then that I was so many months pregnant.
What was it like for you to find yourself pregnant, without a husband, in Derry, in 1944?
It was hard, you know. It was hard. My mum had to go out to work. But then at my age, I didn't understand. Do you know what I mean? I didn't understand. I just thought nurses brought babies in a bag and you had them.
But were you ostracised by people?
Oh, the neighbours would have looked down their nose at you. Some of them were kind, and other ones would have looked down their nose and called names at you, you know. But you just ignore that, you know. Ignorant on their part.
And it didn't stop you wanting to keep your daughter?
Not at all. Not at all. No way. Wasn't a part of it. Definitely not.
Do you think much about that Marine? I can still see a twinkle in your eye.
I do. I do. I could have been married, and I wouldn't. I wouldn't marry again.
Would you have married him?
Definitely. He was nice.
The war effort meant extra work. Canteen and other facilities for servicemen were provided by local women's voluntary groups. The city's clothing industry was at full stretch, producing almost all the shirts for the British Army. There was no such thing as unemployment then. Maeve Kelly worked for the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. It was a case of join the Navy and see the world, even if you didn't leave home. What kind of a difference did it make to life in Derry? I mean, were you conscious that the world was at war when you were here?
Not really, except when the young men did not come back again. But as far as Derry was concerned, it gave jobs. Gave jobs to the people, and in some cases it was kind, you know, gave them the work they needed. And opened up your world, because Derry was sort of quiet in those days. But here, and Belfast thought they were the kingpin of everything. And here was Derry, the most important port in, as they called it, the western approaches. So we were very important people. You know?
I mean, this place must have been extremely congested with ships.
Absolutely. I was just saying there that one of the dockers counted one day 156 warships tied up at Derry, so much so that you could have got on a boat at the back of the Guildhall and walked across boats to the waterside. 156 all in there. So that was some sight, I can tell you.
What was your social life like in Derry at that time?
Absolutely great. Absolutely great. I simply didn't know whether I was coming or going. I loved it. I was able to cope with it. It was just one thing that used to trouble me, and that was if you had a half day, you see, you worked in the morning, and then you had a date with somebody in the afternoon, and maybe we called him Joe, and you had a date with a fella in the evening, and you called him John. My big worry was that I didn't call Joe John, you know, because they were so near one another. But I made one or two mistakes, but I got over it.
During the war, you were in an extremely privileged position, particularly in May 1945, because you witnessed the surrender of the German U-boats.
Coming to it now. We're coming to where I stood. And so I still see them in my mind, you know, the 13 of them in a big long line. I was standing on the docks and watching them come in, and they lined up, and of course the U-boat captain was first, and the sailors were all standing, you know, as they do. And he stepped off, took his cap off, and went forward with his hand outstretched, and out came this British naval officer, Max Horton was his name, an Irishman, I believe, if you don't mind. Max Horton, and he just ignored the outstretched hand. And as I said before, it's a very sad state of affairs, but there are winners and losers, and I thought as one officer, one gentleman to the other, he should have acknowledged his handshake. You know, so he had nothing to lose at this stage.
Those first U-boats surrendered at Lissahalli were joined by many more. The war was over, but these sailors would remain in prison camps for a further 2 years before returning to Germany. As for the submarines, they were towed out to sea and sunk in their former battleground, the North Atlantic, never again to be a threat to shipping. Were you aware of this moment of history at that particular time?
Not really, not at that time, no. But afterwards, when I thought about it, and the way I thought about it was, I bet you every one of those young men, those German men, were sick of the whole thing and heartily glad to be that the whole thing was over, and now they could get to bed and have a wash and have a meal. And I doubt very much if the fatherland came into their thoughts then. I mean, I was thinking of myself, wouldn't I be glad to get rid of this and the end of that awful life out there? It must have been terrible for them.
The U-boats could have made the difference between victory and defeat for the Allies. Winning the Battle of the Atlantic did not necessarily mean that the Allies would have won the Second World War, although eventually they did. Losing the Battle of the Atlantic meant that Germany would have dominated Europe. It would have made the end of the British war effort. It would have meant that Britain would have had to make peace terms in some shape or fashion with Germany. And it would have put so much pressure on the Soviet Union that it's likely that the Germans could have knocked the Soviet Union out of the war.
There was great joy on board my ship. I can imagine all the young officers. You can imagine too. And what should we do in the wardroom? We'd have a drink first, and we did. We had the wee drink. Were we wrong? No, of course not. And we got on a bus, and we came down to Colmore. Over at Colmore, just at the point down there, there's an old building which was used as a yacht club. And we all got up onto the top of this building and looked across at the number of U-boats all along this jetty here.
Your naval experience ended over half a century ago. People of my generation owe you and people of your generation a tremendous debt of gratitude. Do you think that we're thankful enough for what you and people like you have done on behalf of future generations?
You know what? I think the people today are lovely people. But I hope sincerely that the world will be a better place for what has taken place over the past 6 years. Let us hope that people will think before they plunge into action of any sort at all, even local action. Please, let us be a peaceful nation. Let us help each other. Let us help each other for the sake of those people who gave their lives for us.
The Battle of the Atlantic lasted almost as long as the war itself. German submarines were still a menace right up to the last days. In Londonderry City Cemetery, the dates on some of the gravestones bear testimony to that. The remains of 2 sailors from HMS Redmill are buried here. She was torpedoed in Donegal Bay on the 27th of April, 1945, less than a fortnight before the end of the war.
When I left Nyasaland, I just kissed the desk. It broke my heart to leave the ship. The ship and I, and all its crew, of course, and officers, were a great attachment. At the end of the war, half my lifetime.